Hello, in this tutorial, we are going to cover 3 common ways for fixing visually tiling textures. When we use textures to put in our materials and make our materials more realistic looking, what comes along with that is the fact that each texture is just a square or a rectangular image. And so when we want to repeat it across a surface and make a lot more detail, we will run into this inevitably. The fact that when the texture is repeated multiple times, even if the texture is seamless, unless it's one of those dreamy, amazing, strange textures that seems to tile no problem across surfaces. More often than not, it's one of these textures that looks great up close, but then when we look at it at a distance, we see this very visually tiling effect. And most often than not, this happens on landscapes like this one. This is just a reality of working with textures. It's gonna happen. And so we have 3 different ways generally that people tend to try and fix this issue. The first way is to scramble them. When a texture is placed on an object, it uses a set of UVs. UVs are the coordinates, like a map for where the texture should go on the surface. We can use something called texture bombing to take all of those squares that we've added to our object and kind of like scramble them and give them different offsets and blend between the edges. And this repeats them across the surface in a way that looks a lot more natural. The second way we can do that is through distance blending. Distance blending is a way of using one size of texture close to the camera where you're directly standing, like this size here. Close up on the ground will look this size, and then as we see into the distance, we'll use a larger texture size. And this actually has a great added benefit of making distant landscapes look a lot more realistic, because you'd be surprised using the same texture big across a landscape that you use in a small area actually does have a kind of a realism to it, because you're still using the same ground, but you're increasing the size and the variation of the texture over a larger area. That's the second way. The third approach is to use color variation. And this is kind of something that I'm sticking in here because it can be used in conjunction with both texture bombing and distance blending. In fact, they all can be used together, but we'll talk about why in some situations you might not want to use all of them at once. The color variation approach uses a large noise projected down on the landscape that gives us a variation in color across our entire landscape, and it tiles differently than our actual square texture tiles. Because of that, it kind of has this effect of giving a variation over a large area. So these are the 3 different ways that we can approach fixing this tiling issue. Let's talk about texture bombing first. So I'm going to go ahead and right click and make a new material here, and we will call this m_texture bomb. And we will go ahead and drag that onto our landscape and double click on it to open it. And we will go ahead and grab our color, our normal, and our packed occlusion roughness metallic map and drag it into our material here. And I will go ahead and plug them up to base color, up to normal map, and the occlusion roughness metallic I will go ahead and plug into ambient occlusion, roughness, and metallic. So now we have our material set up here. Now this is how we normally set it up. We have our texture, looks good close up, and across the distant landscape it has a very repeating look to it. So how would we use texture bombing to add variation to the placement of the UVs and kind of scramble them around? So there's a node called texture bomb. We right click and we create texture bomb node. Okay, so what a texture bomb node does is it goes in between a texture and the material input here. It doesn't go before the texture, it goes after it. And what we have here are some inputs that go into the node, our UVs and our tiling and our offset and different things like that. So it's a material function that contains a bunch of logic. If you're curious about what it's actually doing, you can always double click on the node to open it up, which will open up the material function so you can check it out. When we look at these nodes, these functions that we're using, they tend to tell us what kind of data we need to read into them. And you'll see that the texture object input here is just that. It's a texture object, it's a texture 2D. What we have here is a texture sample. If you try to plug a texture sample into a texture 2D input, it will not work. So what we need to do is go ahead and convert this texture sample to a texture object. It's just 2 different ways of reading a texture into a material, 2 different ways of dealing with the data that a texture provides. We'll right click on the texture sample and convert it to a texture object. You can see a few things change in the node here. For one, it switches to not have any UV input, which is fine because we have our texture bombing UV input here. So now we can plug our texture object into the input there. Next, we want to go ahead and plug in our UVs. Now, if we had a UV input, we could plug it here. We don't actually need to plug in an input here by default. It will just use just the general texture coordinates of the material. So we don't actually have to plug anything in there, but we do want to plug something in here for tiling. So we can right click here, or we can hold down S to create a float material parameter, and we can call this tiling. And we can plug that directly into tiling. And let's just double check what the standard default value is here, because when we plug these in, we don't want to necessarily break the nodes. You can always hover over an input and it will tell you what the standard sort of default value that it expects is. And so we can go ahead and change this to 4 if we check that. Now we have our tiling. Now let's make one for offset. I will hold down S and click and call this offset, and we'll plug that into there. Now we can go ahead and plug in the base color, and we'll go ahead and hit save. And we'll minimize this material, and we'll go ahead and create a material instance. We'll right click on the master material, create material instance, call it MI texture bomb. And we will go ahead and apply that to the landscape. Now we'll double click on that to open it. You won't see a change by default, and that's because our offset that we plugged in here to our node, our main node, is 0. And the offset here is what determines how scrambled the textures are that will fix this tiling effect. So we'll come back to our texture material instance here, and we'll come over and increase the offset. And by default, you may not actually see a change here. I have personally found when using this node that when we keep the default tiling at 4 here, we don't actually tend to see any changes. And I have a feeling that it is because the texture is repeated in on itself enough times that the texture bombing doesn't really visualize on a landscape specifically. So when we drop our tiling down to like 0.5 maybe, then when we drag our offset around, we can see it is making changes. However, we only plugged our diffuse, our color up, our base color here, and so we're not actually seeing a change in our normal map or our other maps as well. So now we have to come back to our material here, and we're going to go ahead and do the same thing to our normal map. So we'll right click on it and convert it to a texture object. And what we have to do is copy this node here and paste it down here. And we want to plug our tiling, our same tiling in here and our same offset, because we want the color map and the normal map to repeat at the same time so that they stay connected to each other. And so we need to make sure that we plug the same controls for our tiling and offset into both texture bombing nodes. So once we've done that, we can go ahead and plug this into the texture object down here. Next, we need to do this texture here. Now, this runs into an issue because this texture is a packed texture, so we have different values contained in our red, green, and blue channels. And so you'll notice if we right click and convert it to a texture object, we lose those outputs of red, green, and blue. So how do we go ahead and use those textures? First, we'll plug it into our texture bombing input like so, and we'll plug our tiling and our offset in as well. Okay, so, but here, what we can do is we can drag off of here and create a break node. And this will break the float into 3, or rather break the vector into 3 floats, because a color is just a vector. So 3 colors, 3 numbers that represent a color, red, green, and blue. And so even though this is contained in one path here as a vector, we can, after the texture bombing, go ahead and break it out again to red, green, and blue, which lets us use the packed texture in this method. So now we can go ahead and replug in the red into ambient occlusion, green into roughness, and blue into metallic. And if you're not following here, your texture looks different or is not packed in this way, you can usually check what is packed in each channel of a texture by just looking at how it's named. In this case, my texture here has a little ORM at the end, which means that it's packed in occlusion, roughness, and metallic in that order. So red, green, blue, occlusion, roughness, metallic. You might see MRD or something. You might see a lot of different permutations of that, but those are basically it's just telling you what is packed in each channel. If you're not sure, that's where I'm getting that. So now I have texture bombing plugged into each texture input. And so now when we come back here, we will see something amazing, which is that the texture repeating has gone. And we now have a much more natural looking repeating texture across the landscape. You can see here, if we change our offset, it's now changing the whole entire material. And you can kind of see the tiles rearranging themselves as I move the offset. It's pretty cool. All right. That is how to set up texture bombing. Now, this as I mentioned, is just one approach, which scrambles the UV's inputs of a texture so that they come out in different places and rearranged and kind of blended together to get rid of that grid tiling look. What we can also do is blend between a different size of texture when we're close to the camera and when we're far away from the camera. And that is called a camera distance fade. So let's make a new material here to test this. I will right click, make a new material. We'll call this M_distance fade. And we will go ahead and open that up and we'll drag in our textures and plug everything in. Okay. And we'll go ahead and preemptively make a material instance and apply that to the landscape. And we're back to square one here. So opening up this material, the way this works is that we will have two versions of our material. One that is operating at a far distance and one that's operating at a close distance. And this can also be done on individual textures. I'm just going to show you the overall material because it kind of works the best visually, but you could apply this kind of logic to a single texture as well. So the node that we're going to be using here is called the camera depth fade node. So we'll right click and type in camera depth fade. And what this does is creates a black and white mask that changes based on how far something is from camera. And so we can use this to blend between two different versions of our texture or of a material. So let's actually just take a look at what it's doing. We can see it visually in our level by actually just plugging it directly into the base color instead of our texture. And if we go ahead and we do that and we save, we can see a black and white mask. Actually, it looks mostly all white, and that's because the black part is right underneath us. So we need to go and make a few adjustments to this actual node here. So we'll make some parameters. We'll hold down S and make a parameter called fade length, and we'll plug that in, and we'll make that 1000 by default. And we'll hold down S and click and make a fade offset, and we will make that also 1000 by default, and we'll plug that in. Go ahead and hit save. Now, if we open up our material instance that we've applied to our landscape, we can see a mask is now being applied. And we can change those parameters that I just made and see how it works. We can change the fade length to change the smoothness of the blend. We can also change the fade offset to blend it closer or farther away from our position. And you can see it just stays an exact distance away from our camera. So it's a great way to blend between two different options, close and far away. If you're getting a lot out of this video and you've gotten a lot out of my other videos, you might be interested in something that I recently launched called Aziel Art Academy. It's for those of you who are tired of sifting through YouTube videos to try to piece together all the information you need to get good at environment art with Unreal Engine. It basically takes all my courses and combines it with coaching and a private group where you can get all of your questions answered. If this seems like something that you might be interested in and you're looking for more personal attention and support in your Unreal Engine journey, this might be something for you. If you're interested, check out the link in the description below this video. Let's get back to the tutorial. So we'll come back into our material here. So how do we use this to blend between two material options? We have multiple ways that we could do this. The way that is simplest to me is actually to come to our material card here and come over and choose use material attributes. This will collapse our material to use material attributes instead of actually plugging them directly into the card. And so what we can do here is we can right click and make material attributes. And this will create a card here that we can plug all our stuff into again. And this works exactly the same as our other material here, except now we can have multiple material cards in the same material and blend between them for two different material options. And in our case, it'll be a close version and a far version. So the way we blend between these, actually first I'll go ahead and I'll copy and paste this down here. So now there's two versions. And the way we blend between the two of these with a blend material attributes node. If we go ahead and grab that, now we can plug one into A and one into B. And the alpha here will be this camera depth fade that we just made. So we'll come and drag that over here and we'll plug that into the alpha. And then the output goes directly into our material attributes connection. So now we're blending between two different material options, close and far away. In our case, the material options will be UV size, but you could also change their color or their texture. It's completely up to you. You could blend between two completely different materials. It doesn't have to be necessarily a changed version of the original. But if we want to change the UVs here separately, what I'll go ahead and do is I will create a texture coordinate node and I will make a multiply node. And this multiply node will create a parameter here by holding down S and clicking, and this parameter will be UV close size. And we'll make that a 1 by default. And we'll plug that into the UVs of our texture here. Okay, now all we have to do is copy and paste this and plug it into the same texture coordinates. And this one will rename this parameter to be far size. So we have a close size and a far size, and they're just having a different number multiplying here in the multiply node. And we'll go and plug that into the UVs down here. And we'll go ahead and hit save. Now we have two different UV controls, one for the close and the far. Looks like my far size is working, so I can drag it up to create a little bit larger material here. And my close size, I'll keep it pretty similar to what it is right now. Maybe keep it at 1. All right, so now we have a close size and a large size. And the large size maybe we'll make 0.001 or 0.01 rather. Maybe that's too big, maybe 0.05. This is something you can sort of test and play with. We want it to be big enough that it looks realistic and detailed, and not too small that we start to see this repeating pattern here. That looks pretty good. And you can see like the texture at a larger size on these distant mountains actually does look more realistic than if we just had a smaller texture bombed version of the same texture. So this is actually a pretty good technique for making sure that you have like more realistic materials in the distance. It's just literally a larger size of the same texture. It works really well. Okay, so that is the third approach. We have texture bombing, we have masking by distance between two different UV texture sizes or different materials. And now the final method that we can use, and this could be applied to both texture bombing or in this case the texture mask by distance, is using color variation. So I'll jump back into this material here and we'll just use the same material, I think. And what we want to do is grab a noise. Unreal Engine ships with a bunch of textures and things built into the engine by default, and we can access those by going to the settings and choosing show engine content here by default. And then we can come and scroll down here in our content folder here on the right side and come to engine, click on engine, and we're going to go ahead and type in noise. And there's a bunch of noises that are built into the engine, so you will all have that access to them. And I'm going to scroll down here till I come to TNoise01. This noise I feel like is the most useful noise ever. I use it on like a lot of different materials for different things. And so we're going to drag in TNoise1 to our material here. Now, this is going to be used as a mask, so we'll drag it up here and we will go ahead and create a slightly different texture UV input because we want this to kind of be pretty large across the landscape. We don't want it to be repeated as many times as these textures are. We want it to be this really large noise that adds some light color variation. We'll go ahead and we will, actually I'm going to drag it down here. Go ahead and make another texture coordinate node and another multiply node, which fun fact you can create by holding down M and clicking. It's a nice shortcut. And we'll hold down S and click again to make a parameter. And this will be color variation noise size. And this will be, let's keep it at 0.1 maybe. I'm not actually sure. We'll need to test this. We'll plug that into the multiply and this will go into the UVs. Okay, so how do we use this to give variation to our texture color here? So we could do this on both the close textures and the far textures. I'm going to just go ahead and add it to the far distant textures here first, and we'll see how that looks. What we want to do, if I drag my textures down so I have a little bit more space, is we want to take this texture here and multiply it by a color. So we'll drag off of here, we'll type in multiply, create a multiply node. I will connect it to the bottom so it's a little neater, and I'll hold down 3 and click to create a color. And we'll right click on this, convert it to a parameter, and this will be tint color. And we'll plug this into the multiply. Now we want to blend between a tinted version of the texture and its normal version that's untinted. And to do that, we use a lerp node, which is a linear interpolation between two things. So it's like a blend between two options. And so we'll disconnect this by holding down Alt and clicking, and we'll blend between this texture and the multiplied texture. And the tint color will make it a 1 by default, like a white color, because a color multiplied by 1 is nothing. A number is multiplied by 1 is the same thing as itself. So that's why if we multiply the texture by white, we don't see any color change. So that'll be our default there. And then we'll plug in the alpha to the noise here. See if I can make this a little bit more organized. So now we will plug that back into the base color, and we'll we'll go ahead and hit save, and let's go ahead and look at our material here. As I mentioned, we won't see a change here until we come over to the tint color and start changing it. So I'm going to go ahead and change it to a little bit of a brown color, and it looks like it's changing everything. So we'll probably come back to our color variation noise size, which, if you remember, is our different UV input for the texture here. Let's maybe drop it down to 0.004. There we go. Now we can start to see some variation here. So you can see there's kind of this natural noisy kind of blend in color here between some areas are a little bit brighter, some areas are a little bit more brown from this tint, make it a little bit more subtle. This looks pretty good in the distance, but the issue is that we need to apply this to both the close material and the far material. And if you were doing just texture bombing, or you just had a material without this distance fade in it, this wouldn't be an issue. But because we're blending two different material options, we have the color variation version in the background and the non-color variation version in the foreground. So we need to either apply it to both separately or all at once. And so we can actually apply this color variation at the end here after blending our materials. So I'm going to go ahead and disconnect these nodes I made and drag them over, which will be a lot neater. Drag these over here. So this is, we have here our tint multiplied by the texture and lerped with our noise. Okay, so this material blend that we blended into one material input here, we can also grab stuff out of it, back out of it, and do things with it. And the way we do that is with a get material attributes node, and we can come over here and we hit the plus button and choose the thing that we want, which is just base color. So that's good for us. And then what we do is we then combine it back into the stream. So the node we used for that is called a set material attributes node, which is exactly the same in reverse. So now we hit the plus button here, make sure we have the base color input, and hold down Alt, disconnect these, and just plug them in between here. And now we're basically hijacking the base color. We can do something with it and plug it back in. And this way we can just apply this material, this color variation once, all the way at the end, and then we don't have to worry about applying it twice to both these materials. So now I will do the same thing. I'll grab the original base color, multiply it by that color, and then we'll use the lerp node to blend it back on using the noise. And then we'll plug the output back into the base color. Then we'll go ahead and hit save. Now we have it applied to our entire landscape. These are three different approaches to adding variation to your landscape materials or textures so that the textures don't look like they're tiling as badly. And these can be used together. They can mix and match them. They're just three different approaches and ways of dealing with textures, repeating textures. Let's talk about why you'd use one over the other. The main drawback to texture bombing is it has a lot of shader instructions. If we go back and look at our material we had here and we look at the texture bombing material, we can see that just this material here has 352 instructions, which is not bad, but if you have a lot of other material stuff going on, it could become a heavy material pretty quickly. On the flip side, we also have the distance blending material, which has 262 instructions for all this. So that's blending between two different materials and using a distance blend, and we're using the color variation on top of that. So that's only 262 instructions. And the material instructions, of course, requirements will be very different depending on what you're working on. You might not care about them at all, in which case you just use texture bombing or use all three together. It's totally up to you, but I just want to make you aware that the texture bombing, the only downside is that it creates a little bit heavier of a material for Unreal Engine. If you found this video helpful, shoot me a thumbs up or a comment to let me know. And of course, always subscribe for more tutorials like this. If you're interested in learning Unreal Engine specifically with me, you might be interested in Aziel Art Academy. It is a combination of all my courses in one place, regular coaching and custom tutorials, and a great private community where you can share your Unreal Engine journey, get feedback on your projects. If you're interested in something like that, you can find a link in the description. I will see you in the next one.